Hi, in this video I'm going to go through question 6 on the Math 2009 paper. So for the first part of this question, Alice, Bob and Charlie make the following statements. So Alice says that Bob is lying, Bob says Charlie is lying, and Charlie says 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, and we want to know who is telling the truth and who is lying. Well, we know of course that 1 plus 1 is indeed equal to 2, so we know that Charlie is telling the truth. And, well, Bob says that Charlie is lying, so if we know that Charlie is actually telling the truth, then that must mean that Bob is lying. And Alice claims that Bob is lying, and that is true, so Alice must be telling the truth. And so we see that Charlie and Alice are the ones telling the truth, and Bob is lying. Okay, now in part 2, Alice, Bob and Charlie make these statements instead. So Alice says Bob is telling the truth, and Bob says Alice is telling the truth, and Charlie claims that Alice is lying. And we want to know what are the possible numbers of people telling the truth. Well, we know each person is either lying or telling the truth. So let's consider the two cases for Charlie. You could do it for Alice or Bob as well, but I'm just going to choose to do it for Charlie. So what's going to happen if Charlie's telling the truth, and what's going to happen if he's lying? Well, if Charlie's telling the truth and he's saying that Alice is lying, then Alice must indeed be lying. And, well, Alice says that Bob is telling the truth, but if that's a lie, then that must mean that Bob is also lying. And so we see in this case that Charlie is the only one telling the truth and the other two are lying. Okay, now, so what about if Charlie was lying? Then when he says that Alice is lying, that's going to be a lie, and so that means Alice is actually telling the truth. And if Alice says that Bob is telling the truth, and that's the truth, then that must mean that Bob really is telling the truth. So we see that both Alice and Bob are telling the truth. So in this case, we have two people telling the truth. So the possible numbers of people telling the truth is going to be 1 if Charlie is telling the truth, or 2 if Charlie is lying. Okay, and in part 3, Alice, Bob and Charlie now make these following statements. So Alice says that Bob and Charlie are both lying, and Bob says that Alice is telling the truth, or Charlie is lying, or both. And Charlie claims that Alice and Bob are both telling the truth, and we want to know who is telling the truth and who is lying. Okay, so let's suppose that Alice was telling the truth. Then what would happen? Well, then her statement that Bob and Charlie are both lying must be true, right? So that would suggest that Bob and Charlie really are lying. But look at what Bob says. Bob says that Alice is telling the truth, or Charlie is lying, or both of these. And we have that Alice is telling the truth and Charlie is lying. So Bob's statement is actually true. And so that gives us a contradiction. And so it must be that Alice is actually lying. And, well, if Alice is lying, then Charlie's statement that Alice is telling the truth must also be a lie. But then we see that Bob's statement is satisfied because Charlie is lying, and so Bob is telling the truth. And so we see that the lies are Alice and Charlie, and Bob is telling the truth.